Testing, testing.
Yeah, that works. So, and also at the end, after the last question, which I think if people are still, I'd say we could go till 5:15, 5:30, but I don't
Okay.
think it will be that long. Could you, that are, we have another event coming up on October 26th. So that's the next event in our series. Sorry, I didn't email that.
Testing, testing.
That sound like it was working? Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? No. James, can we increase the volume a little bit, maybe? Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Eve Stern, Director of the Center for the Humanities, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the second event in our year-long series, Re-envisioning Nature, an Environmental Humanities Lecture Series. I've been looking forward to Dr. Jeff Bolster's talk for months, and I'm so pleased he was able to be with us in person. But first, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Dr. Rod Mather, historian of the Atlantic world and underwater archaeology, who will introduce our speaker.
Well, welcome everybody. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Jeffrey Bolster, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of New Hampshire. My own interest in history and the sea started at the bottom of the sea many years ago, working on underwater archaeological sites. And when I came to the surface and viewed the historical vista, I was somewhat disappointed. Much of maritime history and indeed naval history at the time was either highly detailed and antiquarian, or it consisted of great sea yarns, entertaining but lacking the articulation of broader historical meaning. Maritime history needed champions who could demonstrate the importance of human-ocean interactions to the broader historical community. In my lifetime, that's happened. The work of historians such as Marcus Rediker and Lisa Norling, Margaret Cretan and Peter Pope, amongst others, have brought us to that world. But the most important of those scholars, in my mind, is tonight's speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Bolster. Dr. Bolster's work has at least three attributes which few in combination can replicate. First, a deep knowledge of the sea, born from working at sea. Dr. Bolster holds a U.S. Coast Guard master's license and has done thousands of miles and hours blue water sailing. A couple of years ago, he and his wife sailed their 40-foot cutter from New Hampshire to New Zealand, as you do. Second, he is a gifted historian who is able to ask new questions and get new kinds of data from historical sources. And third, Dr. Bolster is a terrific writer, one who produces prose that flows and takes you on a journey. His contributions are too numerous to list, so I'll focus on just two. In his first book, Blackjacks, African-American Seamen in the Age of Sail, Dr. Bolster demonstrates the importance of seafaring to both enslaved and free black men in the 18th and the 19th century. The book won several academic prizes and left nobody who read it in any doubt of the importance of maritime topics to the broader historical discourse. Not satisfied with helping the historical community see that importance, Dr. Bolster then helped create a new and emerging field of marine environmental history. His most recent book, The Mortal Sea, Fishing in the Atlantic in the Age of Sail, won numerous prizes, including awards from the American Historical Association and the Bancroft Prize, which is one of the most prestigious awards in American history. It is that work which blends ecology and human history that Dr. Bolster is here with us to talk about tonight, and so it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jeffrey Bolster.
Thanks, Rod, for that generous introduction. Christmas is coming. You're going to want to buy some books for your friends. It's great to see everyone here. Thanks for coming out in the rain, and I guess there's a virtual audience possibly tuned in as well. Thanks especially to Eve Stern for inviting me to play here tonight. My talk draws on my book, which Rod just mentioned. That book would not have been possible were I not part of an interdisciplinary team at the University of New Hampshire for 10 years. We had historians, me and others, and marine ecologists, and we made this forced marriage, and we posed and tried to answer questions that would have been impossible for practitioners in either one discipline alone. Ultimately, I think it really worked, but there were plenty of moments along the way when we simply didn't know. As a historian of early America, trained in the conventions of my craft, I had become convinced that historians should really pay attention to the sea, not just as a narrative device, moving people around, not just connecting disparate cultures, but really paying attention to the ocean and how it changed. So to do this, I thought I would have to reconstruct the lives, or at least some parts of the lives, of flesh and blood people making what they hoped were the best decisions in the circumstances they faced. That meant looking a little bit at their ethics, their ideology, their beliefs, their character. But I also wanted to show changes in the sea over time, and that would require some counting and some quantification and a scientific dimension. So ultimately, that's what I tried to do, and there were plenty of surprises in the story as I went along. Until rather recently, the combined heft of tradition and literature and science largely insisted the sea was immortal. My generation, I see some of the people out here are sort of in my generation. My generation may have been the last one to come of age with those flawed assumptions. We know differently now. Let's try this. So here's a question once incomprehensible. Are the oceans dying? Huge percentage of big fish are gone. This would not have been imaginable when I was a college kid or even early on a grad student. It's easy to blame modern technology for problems in the fishery. It's easy to assume, notice the Rhode Island fishing boats, it's easy to assume that the problems in the fishery, shown by that, it's easy to assume those problems are artifacts of post-World War II. Big steel ships, strong engines, rugged polyester nets, electronic fish finders, pinpoint navigation. And thus it's sort of easy to assume that back in a traditional era, things were different. This picture, painting by Winslow Homer, I love the painting. The Fog Warning, 1885. It's often trundled out as an exemplar of traditional fisheries. Monkey shines. There's nothing traditional in this painting at all. This is 1885. The big fish in the dory is a halibut. They were trash fish until the 1840s, despised, yeah, better? Despised by cod fishermen, cut loose, reinvented as a profitable commodity. They were fished to extinction virtually by the 1880s when this was painted. Same story as the American bison. The gear in the picture, tub trawls, long lines. They were about 35 years old at most. Until then, fishermen had fished over the rail, hand lining. Now they're setting out long lines, hundreds and hundreds of hooks. How about this idea of leaving the safety of your mothership in a dory? Oh yeah, let's go out in God's great North Atlantic in a stinking little rowboat. Who would do that? For centuries, men had stayed on the deck of their ships and fished over the rail. It was safe. You leave in a rowboat, everybody goes out in a rowboat. What's that do? It increases the hook saturation, the footprint around the mother ship where there's going to be more fish in range, but it also leads to a lot of fishermen not coming home. It makes widows and orphans. So this is not a picture of traditional fisheries. It's one historically specific snapshot between that abundance, recounted by people like Samuel de Champlain and John Smith when they first got here, and the tattered remnant of that system that we live with today. It's one historical moment, and what I want to do is reconstruct hundreds and hundreds of such moments. Without genuinely historical perspectives on changes in the sea, we have no idea of the magnitude of the challenges we face. This hometown picture here, that's a wharf in Block Island in the late 19th century, just another day's fishing. American fisheries, we can say, originated from insatiable demands placed on Western European marine ecosystems. In the 15th century, the Little Ice Age, formerly reliable grounds, fishing grounds off of England and the Netherlands, the Low Countries, are failing. In other words, men with the gear at their disposal are bringing home smaller and smaller catches. So what do? Go north. Go fish off the coast of Norway, more virgin stocks. Well, not exactly, but somewhat. And then you go west. Go fish in Iceland. Oh, what a good idea. Sail to Iceland in February. And then you go to Newfoundland, and then to the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Gulf of Maine, okay? Each time you're looking for virgin stocks or relatively unfished stocks that you can fish with your gear. Here we go, province of Maine, Little Ice Age. This picture runs from Massachusetts, Cape Ann, up to the Kennebec River. When Europeans got here, they raved about this coast. fish and timber, building sites. Think of this. It's an ecosystem that none of us has ever seen. From about Portland, Maine, into eastern Connecticut was a coastal savanna, a prairie of grass that looked more like Indiana or Nebraska than the coast of New England. That was the home of the now extinct heath hen. No habitat, no heath hens. It had been created in part by native peoples burning out brush and then colonized by grasses. In the uplands, massive canopy, hardwood canopy, oak, hickory, chestnut, elm, maple, and in the river bottoms, the big white pines that would become masts for the King's Navy. And under all of this is this spongy layer of leaf litter, decomposing leaves and branches and moss, which is filtering the water, both the rain but also the snowpack. It's the little ice age, and there's this big canopy of shade trees. The snow is melting slowly. And that water is percolating through and being filtered and providing in the streams and rivers perfect spawning habitat for anadromous fish, sturgeon, salmon, shad, alewives, etc. So when these explorers and early fishermen got here, here being the Western Atlantic, they saw these things that they knew from home. There were salmon and seals, there were eider ducks and sturgeon and cod. It was all the same stuff. This is not like Magellan's men going to the Philippines and seeing these outrageous organisms, or Columbus's guys in the Caribbean seeing these fish that had no comparison in Europe. No, this is ho-hum. It's all the same old stuff, except the abundances were phenomenal. The amount of organisms and the individual size. Here's Captain John Smith's map, 1616, around which I drew a circle where the ship was. A second edition embellished that with abundance. You see the big school of fish there under the ship. We have been told, I was certainly taught in college in the 1970s, that a lot of those accounts were propaganda. I respectfully disagree. There are dozens of detailed descriptions over more than a century by seamen and landsmen, by clerics and laity, written in French and written in English, and they all speak to the way that ecosystem functioned in different ways, okay? Abundances and distribution and time of arrival in the spring and, just stuff, ecological knowledge. As far as I know, there's not a single refutation from anyone who was actually here at the time saying, that's malarkey, they're making it up. So the perspectives of these guys, as Jacques Cartier and John Smith, they've never been fully understood because their accounts have not been presented in terms of what was normal in European seas. These were men who were alive because they were keen observers of their surroundings. You don't sail ships of the kind they had and make those voyages without paying attention. And as we know, people like Smith, Champlain, and Cartier were very accomplished writers and some of them cartographers. They paid attention. So when they got here, they recognized all the relationships are the same, except there's just so much more of this stuff, living organisms. So what they were seeing is what European systems had looked like thousands of years earlier in the Neolithic. In other words, the indigenous American population here was transitioning at that moment from hunter-gathering, from about the Saco River to the east, primarily still hunter-gatherer people, from the Saco River to the west through Connecticut and whatever, more settled agricultural villages, but still, by European standards, very lightly populated, okay? In Europe, for thousands of years, coastal areas had been fished. Wow. Here's one of the surprises. I went back and I reread all these early New England records and laws and stuff. This is ground that's been plowed pretty heavily. But after permanent settlement, the first two generations of New England magistrates imposed conservation restrictions, although coastal waters teemed with life. They're living in this marine dreamscape, the likes of which they can't imagine because all these guys had come out of those old world systems where they sort of understood how big was a spawning run of anadromous fish or how many whales are swimming along under the cliffs of Dover, okay? Numerous laws between 1660 and 1702 to protect mackerel during their spawning time. A law in 1668 closing the cod fishery each year for 2 months, the spawning season. Laws in 1630s, I love this one, outlawing the use of codfish or striped bass for manuring fields? No, they're too valuable to use as manure. I thought that was pretty rich. Numerous laws to protect alewives, bass, mackerel, and cod. And the reason, these immigrants had arrived carrying knowledge in their heads of what these old world systems look like. And they suddenly said, we can't squander it. So there's 20,000 English people in New England fishing out of these heavy, clunky wooden shallops, and they're saying, we better pass laws to prevent the expenditure of mackerel. It's a different mindset. Still, settlers plucked the low-hanging fruit. This mansion is quite near to where my wife and I live in Portsmouth. We don't live in a comparable mansion, but it was built by a chap named Archibald McFedris, and in 1717, he wrote to a colleague in Ireland that the river is full of salmon. In the season, you may take 1,000 tons. That's not to be interpreted literally, but what he was suggesting is that the river was running silver and there was an active salmon fishery. By the end of the century, the 18th century is just full of data points from observers that keep going like this. By the end of the century, in the same river, Judge Chadbourne, formerly large fish, salmon, bass, and shad have come up the river, but they have forsook it. Lovely turn of phrase. Jeremy Belknap, famous Enlightenment intellectual, the striped bass was formerly taken in the river, but through injudicious use of nets, is almost destroyed. Chadbourne didn't even mention sturgeon. His house was about 3 miles from the creek that is still named Sturgeon Creek. I ride my bike over the bridge on that creek all the time. But by the time Chadbourne was writing this, he was about 60 at the time, the sturgeon had been long since extirpated. They weren't even on his radar. There's one sort of brighter point at that time. The cod fishery is largely sustainable if you look at the entire Western Atlantic. Herman Mall made this engraving to show the stages of the fishery, how it worked in 1720. At that time, for about 200 years, there had been 150,000, maybe 200,000 metric tons of cod being taken out of the Western Atlantic system. Gulf of St. Lawrence, Grand Banks, Nova Scotian Banks, et cetera, okay? And that went on again for another 100, 150 years. So that seemed to be sustainable. There were pockets in places where the cod had been depleted, but in general, big picture, that ecosystem seemed to be able to produce that. But in other ways, by the inauguration of George Washington, the coastal sea had been significantly compromised. This is important to think about. Localized depletions. Well, I've just told you about all these localized depletions of salmon and shad and the rest. Range contractions. Walrus used to breed on islands off Nova Scotia, but as they were hunted very hard, they were pushed farther north. I grew up thinking of walrus as an Arctic species. I certainly didn't expect to sail to Nova Scotia and see walrus on those islands. Extinctions, the Atlantic gray whale. Near extinctions, the great auk, the North Atlantic's penguin. It would not become extinct until 1840, but it was already well on the way. Diminished estuarine productivity. I can really bore you by talking about nutrient circulation in the Gulf of Maine and how farther to the west that was already decreased by the time of George Washington because of all the weirs and dams that had been built on the rivers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, you got the basic idea. Thinking about this talk, Eve asked me to come give this talk in a series on environmental humanities. I thought, well, I got to play the humanities card. So maybe the reason that I'm being invited to present in this series on environmental humanities is because I'm the guy that wrote a pretty serious book in marine environmental history, but I insisted that in that book there was a role for the Gloucester sea serpent. And I've always believed as a historian that we must take past people seriously on their own terms. And so I don't actually believe, based on what I know about contemporary science and taxonomy, that sea serpents exist, okay? There simply hasn't been one that's been collected and preserved and taxonomized and the rest. So, and I've sailed a lot of miles. But there were a lot of people in the early 19th century in New England, some of the best and the brightest, who were quite convinced that sea serpents exist and swam in their dooryard, okay? So to make sure that nobody was going to miss my point, I even put the sea serpent in one of the chapter titles. So if you open the table of contents, you go, ooh, sea serpents in it. What's that about? It seems to me, and this is a line I stole from my own book, that human understanding of nature is always constructed as much through emotion, imagination, and received wisdom as through empirical observation. I mean, science matters, but there's also stories that matter, and people understand their surroundings through their imagination and their emotion. And so it seemed to me that for millennia, the sea had been imagined as unfathomable and limitless. Here we got it, a realm of sea serpents. Something was lost when the sea serpent was dismissed. What do I mean? Well, this happened late 1820s, early 1830s, around that period of time. It's beginning to have less credibility. And it's the very same time that new technologies, the mackerel jig, purse seines, and others, are increasing catches quite dramatically. And so it seems that people in New England began to imagine, oh, we can actually understand the sea more. Oh, we can develop gear so that we can fish them. Oh, it's not so limitless as those old timers used to believe. And we can probably manage it. How'd that work out? Yeah, we can probably manage it. So, in any event, the sea serpent has a minor role in this book, but it's a very important pivot in terms of how people imagine the world around them. All right, Mr. Donnell, fisherman, York, Maine. By around 1850, New England fishermen were not using the word sustainability, but they were thinking about the future of the marine resources on which they depended. And they were not using the word ecology, but they were paying a lot of attention to relationships in the food web and how the system was faring. There had been some complaints in the past about fish shortages. Everyone knew you could whack the salmon and the sturgeon and the shad. That was beyond controversy. But complaints about true sea fish, overfishing, not very common. But the intensity of those complaints increased dramatically during the 1850s and 60s, a turning point. First, systematic concerns about depletion of cod and mackerel and menhaden herring. Why? What changed perceptions? That's part of the one chapter in the middle of this book. This period, middle of the 19th to about World War I, is certainly marked by changes in the sea. And we can march through many of them. You'll see some more in the talk. But basically, decreasing viability of marine resources. It's also marked by a sea change in attitudes about the sea. What do I mean? New narratives. The narratives coming out of fishing villages and off schooners have to do with the D words: depletion, degradation, diminution. I got all these words from the fishermen's narratives. These guys, rough-hewn, callous-hand men, are talking about the system going downhill. And it's a period in which many fishermen, several generations, sought regulation of gear. They sought fishing restrictions. Another sort of surprise to me as I got into this. But the initiative for several generations to keep the fisheries alive was from the fishermen themselves. This is a period that we all think of as industrialization, right? Modernization, 1850, 1915. But again, the fishery is prosecuted in little boats like this pinky schooner. And then, we still have more elegant schooners and seine boats, but the textile machinery of New England that was, of course, making pots of money by making cloth could be adapted within a few decades to making nets. So one of the innovations is to now make nets by machines. Instead of men doing it all by hand, you could now make nets by machines. Then you can make very big nets. So the catching power increases dramatically. Still deployed by sailboats with guys in rowboats, but increased catching power. New means of marketing, delivering seafood to customers. What do I mean? Well, cans. With canning in the 1840s, you could suddenly take a lobster, a big granddaddy lobster or a little bitty tiny baby lobster, and you could throw it in the steamer and then put the meat in a can and ship that can anywhere. And how would you ship it? Oh, railroad trains. Trains are leaving every night to St. Louis and Cincinnati and Chicago. And what's on the train? Well, we have ice now. Clever Yankees are harvesting pond ice. And you can put the ice on the train, and then you can put fish on the ice, and the guys in St. Louis or Cincinnati or the housewife in Chicago can buy fresh fish. Wow. So suddenly, new species are being targeted. None of these species were fished in the colonial period except for immediate local consumption. My daddy always taught me, don't eat a dead lobster, okay? You want to put that lobster alive into the boiling water. So fish like menhaden, lobster, sardines, swordfish, halibut, none of these had been fished in the colonial period. The only thing that was viable to package and really ship long distances was cod and mackerel, okay? I don't get into all the details about fat content and stuff if you want, but we'll skip that right now. What's also going on in this period? Science. Beginning in the 1860s, the U.S. government set up the U.S. Fish Commission. By later in the 19th century, this is the most generously funded R&D program in the United States. Spencer Baird and his guys had massive infusion of federal dollars to save the fishery. So there's scientists in places like Woods Hole that are working on a number of fisheries-related problems. And there's state fish commissions then set up as well as the feds. So there's a lot of scientists and a lot of money behind this dealing with fisheries. Spencer Baird was the head of the U.S. Fish Commission. His assistant, George Brown Goode, was actually one of the founders of the American Historical Association. That's my crowd. These guys fully admitted that cod stocks were depleted. They're going down. But they thought the reason was because shad and alewives, the forage fish, had been hit hard by all the mills and the dams and the weirs and the pollutions in New England rivers, and that if you could somehow restore those fish, which they hoped to do in labs like that one, fish propagation, the way today the State Fish Commission puts trout into the streams near your house so you can go catch them. The feds were putting big money for many decades into propagating sea fish to launch little larvae into the North Atlantic. So that's what these guys were about. This allowed them to promote their fish propagation and to suspend attention to overfishing, which kept them cozy with more industrial interests that didn't want to hear about overfishing. But the New England fishermen didn't entirely agree. So we have in the middle of the 19th century the scientists saying, it's fine, you can't screw up sea fish, just fish harder. It's all going to be good, we're going to save the day. And the fishermen going, no, I don't think so. I think we better be more careful about this. Part of the answer to what fishermen's concern was is, I think, an article that our group wrote together, Modeling Cod Biomass Using Historical Records. It's part of that forced marriage of historians and marine scientists. We found a remarkable run of records in the National Archives, cod fishing logbooks from the 19th century with extraordinarily detailed data. Every boat that wanted to qualify for the federal subsidy had to submit its log at the end of the year. And the log showed the position of the boat every single day in the summer. They had to fish 120 days. How many men were on board, the names of those men, how many fish each man caught each day, because they got paid by how many fish they caught, and then what the weight of the catch was at the end of the trip. Ooh, wow, that's a lot of material. So, for instance, this map shows the blue is the banks off Nova Scotia. You know, to the right. Oh, wait, sorry, kids. Wrong one. Back up, back up. Wrong button here. Trying to get the little red dot. To the right of the yellow zones, you see the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. To the left, you see Cape Cod and Georges Bank. The blue banks are the Nova Scotian banks, and the yellow zones are the modern fisheries management zones, okay, just to orient you to the old-timey map. So here's one boat, the Angler. You know, our group could tell you, as if we'd had a satellite camera suspended over the banks, what this boat was doing every day that summer, okay? But we had a lot of those boats. We had 325 boats, and then we had data collected from the captains along the way from 1,300 other boats. So we had some data from 1,600 New England schooners catching codfish in the 1850s. And what we found is that catches went down from about 27,000 fish a summer to 13,000 fish a summer per boat. Anybody trying to run a business realizes that if your gross product is going to go down by 50%, you're in trouble. The statisticians in our group, it's not me, ultimately were able to do a population modeling, Chapman-Delury analysis, to estimate cod biomass. You see the blue dot, about 1.25 million metric tons of cod. You can see that another study by Myers et al., Dalhousie University, totally different data, totally different methodology, suggested that the actual carrying capacity, how many fish could swim on the Nova Scotian shelf, it's like how many angels could dance on the head of a pin, that carrying capacity was within the confidence intervals of our estimate. So we thought it was pretty reasonable. Down in the lower right corner, you see the squiggly lines to show what cod stocks have been in our lifetimes, not as robust. I can't tell you with certainty why cod landings went down so dramatically in the 1850s. My hunch is, I think it's a pretty good hunch, is that there was a natural downturn, quite likely in climatic conditions or disease or nutrients that led to less forage, which could start in the bottom of the food chain with plankton, and that was exacerbated by fishing pressure. Downturns in fisheries are often occurred through a natural downturn of some sort, exacerbated by human fishing pressure. But the guys at the time were pretty sure they knew what was going on. It's the French, those damn Frenchmen. It's always the foreigners. The French surround us with their trawl, their long line, and so they get most of the fish. So beginning in the 1850s, as cod catches are plummeting on the Nova Scotian shelf, discussions are raging about depletion and the need for conservation. I love this painting, Fitzhenry Lane, Gloucester Harbor. If you looked at the size of the fish under the table, what they're cleaning there in the 1850s, you wouldn't think, oh, this ecosystem doesn't have any problem. These guys are catching fish like that in day boats. Wow. Anybody know what this one is? Menhaden, the gentleman out there has the right answer. Give him a cigar. This is a menhaden. It's not a fish that people like to eat. It's really not very tasty to us. It's oily and bony. These fish were ignored by fishermen for centuries. In fact, they were generally referred dismissively as farmers' fish. In the 1790s, there were learned articles in ag journals about how to manure your fields in Rhode Island and Connecticut and Long Island, New York, with menhaden because your soil is being spent, okay? And the fishermen were generally pretty contemptuous about them for anything except letting them swim around. Here's Blue Hill, Maine, a little hamlet on the Maine coast, nice little town. In 1850, just about the time that there were already the beginnings of a more commercial menhaden fishery on eastern Long Island and Rhode Island, where people are processing those fish for oil. Oh yeah, the whales, the oceanic whales population seems to be going down, but we still have this desire for oil. So if we can't get the oil from the biggest creatures in the sea, we can get it from some of the smaller creatures in the sea, and that's why they were catching menhaden, okay? In 1850 in Blue Hill, Mrs. John Bartlett, an elderly lady, the sources say, I assume that means she was younger than I am now, but she started the menhaden wars on the coast of Maine. What happened? Well, she kept hens, and her husband and son would occasionally, they were day boat fishermen, they would gill net some menhaden, and she would boil the menhaden in a kettle on the beach and make fish mash that she'd feed to her hens. But the oil would rise to the top. Being a thrifty Yankee, she put it in a bottle, and one day that summer she found herself in Boston, and she offered the bottle to an oil merchant named Eben Phillips, and he said, I'll give you $11 a barrel. That was a lot of money in the coast of Maine. So she went home, and her son and her husband went out, and they gill netted some more menhaden, and she boiled them up, and they got the oil, and off we're going. Within a couple of years, a number of her neighbors are involved as well, and the oil merchant outfitted them with these screw lever presses, which are like cider presses. And it's a going concern. They're making money from fish. It's the mid-coast of Maine. That's what you do. The Booth Bay fishermen are outraged. This is going to drive the menhaden off the coast. The Deer Isle Syrian Sedgwick fishermen were outraged too. And as I worked my way through the Maine archives, I found hundreds and hundreds of petitions from a lot of pissed off fishermen. Every once in a while, you get the alternative. I love this one. We're strongly in favor of free trade in pogies. Pogies is the slang for menhaden. Fears of a dearth are hypothetical. But for the most part, the fishermen are requesting the legislature to intervene to stop the destruction of these little fish that they had been ignoring for centuries. So I'm trying to figure out why their knickers are in such a twist. In other words, the guys on the coast go out in day boats and they catch cod and they put them in barrels with salt and they send them to the west and they get money. The guys on the coast go out in day boats and they catch mackerel and they put them in barrels on shore with some brine and they send them to the west and get money. And now some guys on the coast are going out in day boats and they're catching menhaden and boiling them up and putting the oil in barrels and sending it to the west and getting money. And their neighbors are pissed off. Wow, something's going on. So this is, of course, right at the same time that those cod catches are plummeting on the offshore banks and that there's all these concerns expressed about the state of the ecosystem. Well, the menhaden fishery became America's first industrial fishery. There's the first menhaden factory in Maine. They already existed here in Rhode Island and Long Island, where real industrial apparatus to process fish. In 1870, the first motorized fishing vessel in America, right here in Rhode Island, a menhaden steamer. By 1877, there's a big fleet of them in Maine. It's America's first industrialized fishery. Disaster, 1879. No menhaden east of Cape Cod. They just didn't show up that summer, and they didn't show up for 6 years in a row. 6 years is like a blip in ecological time. But in economic time, it's not a blip, it's a crisis. And so you have these factories going under, boats tied up, men out of work. What's happening? Where are the fish? Well, it turns out that just the year before, as much menhaden had been taken out of the system as would be taken out for the next 60 years. Even while the next 60 years, they're using spotter aircraft to find the schools, bigger boats, more efficient purse seines, the whole apparatus. But in 1878, they're hitting them hard right from Virginia, up past New Jersey, up past Long Island, all the way up to Massachusetts and Maine. What happened? Well, lots of controversies. And I worked in the Nova Scotian archives, same drill. Massachusetts archives, same drill. Our group was fortunate enough to find more logbooks. Boy, did we have logbooks. Inshore logs of the cod fishery would give us a sense, if we could process them, to figure out what was the reality. When these guys were complaining about the fishery in crisis, what was actually going on? So again, we have these inshore logbooks. For instance, I could tell you how many codfish were caught in the Frenchman's Bay Customs District. There's 16 customs districts in New England. In 1861, 148,000 fish. I put this slide up some years ago at a Rockland, Maine cod symposium. There was this gasp from the audience. And this woman stood up and introduced herself as Cindy Smith and said, I run the inshore trawl survey for the state of Maine, and there's no cod in Frenchman's Bay now. And I said, well, in 1861, there was 148,000 at least. Okay. We were able to figure out, and again, these are my mathematician colleagues on the team. I was not doing this math work. Estimated landings in the Gulf of Maine, 62 to 78,000 metric tons. There's a lot of wiggle room in the numbers, and I can explain that if you'd like. But it's based on 1,664 logbooks from the New England coast, okay? Well, it's called 70,000 metric tons. More recently it's been 3,000 or 4,000 metric tons, maybe 9 in a good year. Not so good. So it appears to us that this fishery is flourishing, and yet contemporaries didn't see it that way. They were convinced they were already in trouble. That was their belief, that was their ideology, that's what they had by connecting the data points in their lives. So Maine fishermen try to prevent tub trawling, introduce an act to the legislature. 10 years before, in Swampscott, Massachusetts, fishermen had said, if this longlining is allowed to persist in 10 years, cod and haddock will be as scarce as salmon. And now 10 years later, here's men introducing legislature, getting their legislators to introduce legislation to stop this new technology, which they think is more destructive. Jotham Johnson, can't stop this wholesale destruction. Farewell to our fishery on the coast of Maine. Hundreds of such petitions in all the coastal states and provinces, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, etc. So The numbers generated tell a story that everyone in this room is expecting to hear. There used to be a lot more fish, right? But the same numbers told a really different story to people on the ground at that time. And Spencer Baird, again, the head of the Pinnacle, the Fish Commission, said in 1873, the restoration of our exhausted cod fisheries is the single most important thing we can do. My little red dot works, you know, this, yeah, right there, that's about 1873. That's when Baird said to restore the cod fisheries, and that's how they went until 1928, and then that's how they are for today. So, didn't really work out. So conservation sentiment is at its height among fishermen across New England and Nova Scotia, 1850s, 1880s, a host of different laws. Most notably, the feds closed the mackerel fishery for 3 months a year for 5 years in 1887. There was concern that was being reflected by politicians. Yet confronted by smaller catches, fishermen adopted new gear and they pressured the system. This, to me, is the most frightening slide in this show. In part, I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I know this harbor very intimately. The Portsmouth fisheries employ 10 vessels, that's schooners, 40 small boats, 100 men, 1 million pounds of codfish landed at one wharf. Kicker. In and about the harbor, there's now sunk 63 miles of trawls, long lines, on which are hung 96,000 hooks. Holy smokes. Not long ago, the fishermen would have said such a practice would be immoral. Oh, by the way, these are big hooks that would not catch the little fish that were later cleverly named scrod. Scrod didn't yet exist. That was a cod that had been screwed. But these were big hooks that were just taking big fish, okay? Later, scrod would be invented when trawlers dragging fine mesh nets were just pulling up everything. But so this is frightening because we have so much testimony from fishermen trying to prevent this thing, but they also go along and do it. Like the Newfoundland fishermen, by the time the Minister of DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, closed the Newfoundland cod fishery in 1992, the fishermen knew that they were partly culpable. They understood what had happened, but it was a tragedy. They were sort of caught up in something bigger than they were able to sort. Okay, these are the crashes that occurred in the late 19th century. Of the 4 species that crashed catastrophically, only one had been fished in the 18th century. Only the mackerel. These other had been just invented as desirable in the 19th, and they were pushed so hard in the space of some decades that their populations crashed. One lesson from those crashes, and I could talk about any of them if you're interested, but eluded people at the time, and it's this. It's very important. Those 4 fisheries represented a spectrum of gear. The Menhaden fishery is the industrialized fishery of the future. The lobster fishery is like individual guys rowing their dory or peapod against the tide, hauling traps by hand. And the mackerel and halibut fisheries are pursued by the finest sail-powered fishing boats the world has ever seen. A real spectrum of gear. You can't even talk about it in the same breath. And yet, it's not the gear that led to the pressure on those species. It was the animating spirit behind it, okay? It's people imagining that, oh, nature will buffer itself no matter what. It's people imagining, having the sense that nature is separate from people. It's people imagining that ecological depletion would naturally accompany economic development. And so they sort of knew it was bad and wrong, and yet they just kept doing it. It's a milestone in Atlantic history. With the mackerel and halibut collapse, Americans looked to Europe. For centuries, New World people had eaten from New World ecosystems, marine systems, but New World people had not eaten from European systems. The movement of fish was all one way, from the Americas to Europe, right? And suddenly it's changed. When there's no more halibut, what do Americans do? Oh, they sail to Iceland, basically on the doorstep of Europe, to make their halibut trips. They sail to South Africa looking for mackerel. They begin to import mackerel from Ireland. Maine's fish commissioner said, this is a crisis. If we're importing mackerel from Ireland, the New World is over. What's it say about the Republic? Reversing the trajectory of history. So by 1900, small-scale fishermen are using gear their fathers and grandfathers had protested. Ocean productivity is declining as stewardship declines. Increasing recognition that as New Englanders had changed the land, so were they changing the sea. But stay tuned, because something is going to change here. In 1912, a congressman from Massachusetts introduced legislation in the U.S. Congress to outlaw landing fish from steam trawlers, the behemoth in the background. Mayor John Fitzgerald, Jack Kennedy's grandfather, testified to Congress. He said, "I am the mayor of the largest fishing port in the Western Hemisphere, and I am opposed to this because I've been across to the other side." You know, he was an Irishman at heart. "And I've seen what these steam trawlers have done in European systems." The Gloucester Board of Trade sent their director or chairman or whatever he was to protest to the Congress, "Don't let this steam fishery come in because we've seen what is done in Europe already." Well, you know what happened. The Congress, blah, 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 blah. And they finally accepted the report from the Fish Commission that said, keep your eye on this because it's going to get worse. And the Congress did not outlaw it. And the next time the Congress really paid attention was the 1970s. Yeah, it was a little late by then. New York Times, within 2 years, ran an article very similar to that Newsweek cover I put up for you early on here. They took all the data that taxpayers had paid for, the U.S. Fish Commission, the State Fish Commission, and they crunched the numbers, and they said, what has happened with our fisheries? Cost to consumers rising, decrease in supply, drastic regulation needed. Well, what happened there? Not much. We're getting to the end of this piece, and it's that despite serious opposition, by about 1925, otter trawling was the new normal. The steam draggers had become the new norm. And the fishing interests at this point, rather from resisting it, began to embrace it. And the narratives which they had told, the degradation, diminution, depletion, those narratives, they sort of got swept up in this avalanche of cheap fish because the draggers are bringing in half again as much on every trip as a hook fishing schooner. And you can't argue with a payday. 1930, this is amazing to me, again, one of these surprises, the conversation remained the same. It was formatted around depletion versus abundance. But in the 1930s, scientists and fishermen switched sides, literally like that. Scientists in Woods Hole said the year classes of haddock on Georges Bank, Great South Channel, have been really bad, 1927, 28, 29. We're not going to have any haddock. We got to impose some restrictions, fish with bigger mesh or something. And the fishermen said, the hell with you. If we don't catch them, the Canadians will. Press on, fish harder. Wow, these are the same fishermen who a generation before were saying, we better do something about this. There's a denouement that you're probably more familiar with. It takes us to where we are today. That's the epilogue to my book, but I'll end with this slide. Authors like it when their books get reviewed, especially if their books get reviewed favorably. This book was reviewed in the Washington Post by Jonathan Yardley, and he's one of their conventional reviewers. I'm going to read you the last two lines of his review. The first line is one that I wrote, which he's quoting from my conclusion. I wrote, ultimately, the scale of this story, spanning centuries and stretching across the North Atlantic, reveals, as few other tales can, the tragic consequences of decision-makers' unwillingness to steer a precautionary course in the face of environmental uncertainties. That was my sentence. And then Yardley wrote, anyone who thinks that passage, or this book, is only about fish is living in a fool's paradise. He got it. Thank you. Good. All right. Oh. Karaoke? Can we do a little?
Hello? Ooh, there we go. Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I've been asked to bring the microphone around for questions. I'm going to start with one, and then we'll go from there.
Right.
Okay. So you talked about the French and the Canadians. So at what point, I mean, certainly in the 17th century, there was fierce competition between nations. At what point do we see this story of we've got to keep the other people out of our fishery?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if I can answer that specifically. I mean, certainly in the very early days, we had the Basques, we had the French, we had the English, we have some Portuguese. In 1517, an Englishman named John Rutt sailed into what's St. John's, Newfoundland, a very cool harbor, very narrow entrance, and you get into this inner bay. Been there a number of times. And he counted, he listed in his log about the various nationalities, most of whom I just rattled off. And they were all fishing there, right, at the same time. So there was this sort of coexistence for a while. I think it's the 18th century, Rod, when you just began to have more of those territorial disputes. There was a chap who was a grad student at UT Austin that wrote a book about this, sort of the diplomacy of fishing. But I'm going to punt and say that I can't answer with any specific dates or treaties or diplomatic situations about when nation states began to vie with each other, although certainly blaming the foreigners has a long and noble history. Even after we got the exclusive economic zone here in the United States and other countries to determine that a nation could extend out 200 miles to control its resources, uranium nodules on the bottom or fish in the water column or whatever, there were still then licenses given to foreigners. I mean, there were a lot of foreigners still fishing in American waters after the 200-mile EEZ was supposedly sovereign. So in general, I just have to fall back on that old saw, which is that it's always easy to blame the foreigners, right?
Questions?
Thank you. So you mentioned in the 1930s there's a switch of mentality between the scientists and fishermen. Now the fishermen want to fish more. Besides competition, were there any other reasons for that shift in mentality?
For a long time, the Fish Commission, the scientists, had said, fishermen, we're here on your team. We're going to develop better gear, and we're going to learn more about the life habits of fish. They're doing tagging and all sorts of studies and trying to figure out when anadromous fish arrived. And, for a long time, people didn't know what mackerel did when they disappeared. We know now that they overwinter in very large schools out on the edge of the continental shelf. So the scientists are trying to find that information, telling the fishermen they're going to be fine. And the fishermen are more guarded and worried that the resources are depleting. By the time we get to the 30s, you have to understand that the American government was not doing much to subsidize its fishermen. They had had this cod bounty from the 1790s to 1866, and that did subsidize fishermen. But by the early 20th century, fishing boat technology from other countries was outstripping that here. And Americans were fishing what we would call antiquated mom and pop sort of operations, older boats, smaller boats, antiquated gear. And they're just being beat by the foreigners. And so there was a sense among fishermen that was, I think, absolutely correct, that the government was stabbing them in the back, And so ultimately what happened is when the scientists began to say, oh, you got to dial it back, lads. You got to fish with bigger mesh. You can't hit them as hard. By the early 30s, the fishermen are saying, screw you. It's literally, if we don't get them, the Canadians will. And you get that polarization. So I, of course, came of age with great animosity between fishermen and scientists. But it wasn't always like that, Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
You mentioned the 30s specifically when it comes to the conflict between the scientists and the fishermen. To what degree do you think that can be credited to the Great Depression and kind of the economic downturn a lot of fishermen were probably facing during that time?
Yeah, that's related partly to the answer I just made to the previous question, which is that fishermen felt by then abandoned by the government. Obviously, the Depression is a downturn. Everybody is suffering, but the fisheries felt particularly left behind. And that would persist really up until the 70s. And, you know, in the 50s, you get the first factory freezer trawlers from England out there on the banks. And then a few years later, the Russian industrial espionage is imitating those ships, and they're out there. And I talked, actually in the early 70s, I was sailing up in Newfoundland, and I talked to these fishermen from York Harbor and Lark Harbor, and they were basically still doing dory fishing with cod traps. And they said, Jesus, boy, they're fishing out there with ocean liners, you know, and you sit here in the village at night and you look out and it just looks like a city out there with all those lights, and how can we compete against that? American fishermen in the 30s, 40s, and 50s felt much the same way. Antiquated gear, abandoned by the government. We got to, you know, sort of stay together and just fish harder.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if the fish have a chance after seeing all of this. I know a person who has a sea kayak, and he has a fish finder in the sea kayak. So it seems like the problem of outdated gear is not there anymore.
Right. So I have joked through time that we're getting pretty close to the point where every 15-year-old kid with a 13-foot Boston whaler will have a side-scan sonar and a fish finder with it, okay? We're getting to the point where the gear is such that people who really want to can, you know, quote, find the last fish, right? So this is threatening. You know, in answer to your first question, do the fish have a chance? I've written a number of books. My two most important books, the ones Rod mentioned. The first one is a romance. It was a book in African-American history, and it was about people, indomitable people, overcoming great odds and persisting in the face of incredible oppression, okay? And that's like the unquenchable human spirit. And that was an upbeat book to write, and I liked it. And then I wrote this book, and it's a tragedy. And it's people doing and persisting through time, doing what they knew was not going to have a happy ending, and it's largely gotten worse. I can point to more recent success stories, management regimes here in New England that have to do with striped bass and that have to do with lobsters and that have to do with a haddock, okay? I can tell you those stories. Eider ducks, 100 years ago, there were probably 10 nesting pairs of eider ducks in the entire Gulf of Maine. Right now, there's big rafts of eider ducks. Oh, okay. Yeah, what do we do? Well, Migratory Bird Act and a few protections. So there are some upbeat stories. But globally right now, what are the Chinese doing? What are these rogue fishermen doing, fishing the edges of Antarctica? You know, my wife and I went on a long sailing trip, I guess you heard about, and we were in the Galapagos. We sailed into the Galapagos one morning at dawn. It's like, ah, cool, we're in the Galapagos. And the wind had died, so we turned on the engine, and had the engine on for 10 days, and we're heading into Wreck Bay on San Cristobal, and we were surrounded by sea turtles. I got a lot of miles behind me. I spent thousands of days on boats in the Caribbean and North Atlantic and elsewhere, okay? And I've swum with turtles and done all that stuff. I had never seen so many turtles. Well, the Galapagos right now is a marine sanctuary, okay? You know, but when we left, and there's all sorts of marine life, but when we left, we're heading then towards the Marquesas a month later. Fishing boats right out there on the edge. We know today from all sorts of observation equipment that the Chinese fleets and other fleets are fishing right around the perimeter of that sanctuary, that you know, protected area. And sometimes, of course, pirate fishermen will go inside. So it's really hard for me to be upbeat. It's really hard for me to be upbeat right now, and I hate being, you know, gloomy Gus, or Debbie Downer, but it just looks globally like things are pretty bad. And I'd love for some of you younger people to convince me otherwise. You know, your generation's got to do a better job than my generation has done, but it doesn't look good to me except these sort of localized success stories here, you know, Ghost of New England or whatever.
Other questions? I'd argue that the challenges are the same and they're inherent in human nature. I witnessed battles between fleets in different ports, between gears, 40, 5 years of doing fisheries, the biggest battles were between big game fishermen and commercial fishermen. Right now, you can get a 35-foot contender, put two 300 horsepower engines on the back of it, and you can fish in areas you never could have gotten to when I was tagging sharks in the 70s and the 80s.
Yep.
You come back and you've destroyed kidneys because that's a rough ride going that fast. But you can see, and now there's supposedly no sale. The longline industry is reduced by 75 to 80%. There's 70 active boats.
Right.
They still have an international quota, but they're out of it. There are so many, they still have time area closures out there that I did the calculations for 27 years ago. And we know there's been a regime shift, which has shifted and doubled the number of oceanographic eddies north of the north wall of the Gulf Stream. And no one has redone any of the calculations. And look in the press, a single white marlin went for $4.5 million. Didn't feed anybody, and you are not going to stop that political force.
And you talked about the guys that only had 2 outboards on their boat. The real guys got 4 or 5 now.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was actually out there tagging sharks in the 70s too. We could talk about that.
I did 102 weeks on Polish boats.
No, I was a
Tagging.
cozy
We
American.
were off Hatteras, and we were surrounded by 35 or 40 boats, and they were hanging high flyers off the side. And we went back and we helped the observers on those foreign boats identify the sharks. And we spent a whole day just running in circles, picking up these high flyers and telling them how they could distinguish between silkies, black tips,
Yeah.
duskies, sandbars, all that kind of stuff.
Cool.
So I'm retired 2 years, and I can get relapses into some of these things. But
Yeah.
there are amazing stories of recovery. Some of the turtle population.
Right.
Swordfish is back.
Swordfish came back like gangbusters, right? And so I can tell some of those stories, but when I still think sort of globally or cosmically, it looks grim to me. And, you know, I lived in Northern Europe for a while, and you look at those seas, you know, off the coast of Denmark or whatever, and there's just virtually nothing there. I mean, you go up in the Baltic, which geographically looks like the coast of Maine, there's no birds, there's no fish. I mean, so, yeah. Examples of recovery, examples of progress, of management, but up against a decline. Here's an example that I've used in the past. If you talk to fishermen today, some of them can say, it's really better than it was 20 years ago, okay? And I'm not going to dispute that. Depends what species you're talking about and all the rest. But what we're seeing is that they see this little uptick in their lifetime. And what that's up against is this downward trend that's gone on for centuries. And now a guy my age says, well, you know, it's getting better. He's exactly right. He's not a liar. But this is the shifting baseline syndrome, which is that, as I said in my slide earlier with the Block Island picture, unless you have historical perspectives, you simply don't know the magnitude of the restoration challenges you're facing. Because things are better now than they were 20 years ago, but that's up against a 500-year history on the Western Atlantic, and that's up against a 3,000-year history of fishing in the Eastern Atlantic. How are we doing?
Other questions?
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I wanted to ask something from the ecological point of view. You mentioned the Baltic and the productivity lost. Whenever I read accounts of pre-exploitation ecosystems, like in your book and others, I always wonder how those pre-exploitation ecosystems worked. Like, where was the energy coming from? Where was the food that fueled that? Because apparently there was orders of magnitude more production. And how did it work? Where was that coming from? And where did it go? Is it lost from the ecosystem now?
Great question. You may know some work by Spencer Apollonio, who is a research scientist. He was also on the Maine Fish Commission for some years, and he had a boat next to, my wife and I had a boat some years ago. Our moorings were next to each other, and He and I used to talk. He was this very senior scientist, and I was like a young green historian with a big beard. But he's written some things that might illuminate your question that has to do with productivity. If we think about large, long-lived organisms like whales, which were once very numerous inshore in the coastal system, you know, right whales among others, the right ones to kill, those long-lived organisms lock up a tremendous amount of biomass over a long lifespan. He says those might have been governors in the ecosystem. Then if you look at bird populations, and you get birds like, you know, gannets or puffins or, you know, auks in the day or whatever, again, these are organisms that typically last individually for a fairly long time, and they do better than the ups and downs of the most dramatic swings in the ecosystem, because they only need to find some capelin or some herring or whatever for their young. But what he was getting at is that we may well, by having withdrawn so much biomass from the system, whether it's birds, seals, whales, cod, haddock, halibut, that some of those governors that were once there no longer exist. You know, it was a somewhat speculative piece, but I think it's worth pursuing. You know, on a very small scale, whenever I see a driveway made of crushed oyster shells, I think, no, those oyster shells should have gone back under the oyster beds to allow the next generation of spat to adhere, you know. So we know that there's been a lot of habitat destruction. We know that there's been pollution. We know there's been overfishing. But there's a lot of things we don't know, and it has to do with how that ecosystem functions. You know, if you read, I think James Rozier is the most astute, biologically astute of the explorers, you know, early 1600s, coast of New England. And he's commenting about the different sort of species and how they interact in some ways. And the picture that he paints there with words is illustrative of this really compellingly productive ecosystem. Even when our team was working on those logbooks from the Gulf of Maine fishery, mid-19th century, in order to support 70,000 metric tons a year of withdrawals of cod from the system, there had to be a very robust forage base that had to go all the way down to the plankton level and come up through fish like herring and menhaden to allow that much cod to exist and to be caught every year. So these are questions that I don't think, you know, we yet know the answers to, but they're good questions.
Anybody else?
One goal of our Environmental Humanities lecture series is to get humanities scholars and scientists talking to each other and learning from one another. And your work does an amazing job of bringing together the humanities with the sciences. And I wondered if you could comment on how the two disciplines could do a better job of communicating.
Yeah. You know, we found in this sort of forest matter, the way this happened is that there was a group called the Census of Marine Life, and it existed for 10 years, 2000 to 2010. I had applied for a Fulbright chair. This is going to be a slightly long answer, but I'll get there. I had applied for a Fulbright chair in Denmark, and in my application, I said, I've just started teaching this course at the University of New Hampshire in marine environmental history, which I'm sort of making up because it doesn't exist. I had no idea, but one of the Fulbright readers, the senior scholars in Denmark, was a fisheries historian named Paul Holm, who was working on some of the same stuff. So he said, oh, this guy Bolster. Meanwhile, one of his colleagues was a fisheries scientist from Woods Hole named Tim Smith, and he knew Andy Rosenberg at UNH. And so suddenly these two guys said, oh, there's two guys at UNH that work on this fish stuff. I don't even know they know each other. We didn't at the time. But what if we call them up and dangle in front of them large pots of money and international fame if they want to join our party and do like interdisciplinary fisheries research? So we had this meeting at UNH where Andy and I came together with Tim and Paul, and Andy and I didn't know each other. Turns out we actually had, you know, lots of friends and stuff in common. But and so we said, yeah, we can do this, sure. You know, it's like, I don't know how we're going to do it, but we'll do it. And so we got some grad students, some postdocs, and some undergrads, and we began to and it worked. I was at meetings in Europe at times that were so controversial, it was like people screaming at each other and pounding on the desk. You know, I felt like Khrushchev with his shoe beating on the desk there. People have really different expectations in those careers. The products you are expected to produce, the benchmarks that you need to get promoted, they're really different. The way that you work with graduate students, it's really different. And what we found, talking out of turn here a little bit, but some of the way that people came together, there were historians in this crowd, and this was a big international crowd. We had research teams or Census had research teams in, you know, South Africa and Russia and Latin America. And it's basically, it wasn't Asia, but it was the rest of the world, New Zealand, Australia, Northern Europe, US. There were historians who were like wannabe scientists. They wanted to quantify. And they would say, oh, that humanities stuff is so fluffy. No, we need numbers. And I'd say, wait a goddamn minute. And then there were scientists who actually wanted to be more like narrative historians, you know, and some of their colleagues are going, well, I don't know about this, Tim. So it was awkward. And ultimately, we got a group of first-year graduate students, and we tried to explain to them that they were going to be canaries in the coal mine, okay? And we said, if you guys are willing to come do this, it sounds really cool and sexy, interdisciplinary, but it means there's a good chance you're going to end up as neither fish nor fowl. You're not going to be a scientist, and you're not going to be a historian, and you're going to be screwed. And so there were Americans, Canadians, and Danes who decided to take the risk, and they went for it, and actually, almost all of them have ended up having pretty good careers and making tenure, whether in environmental studies departments or history departments or whatever. But there was this excitement of making it up as we went along. But when you say about how, you know, historians and scientists should, or humanists and scientists should communicate more with each other, yeah, it's probably better not to swear at each other and pound on the table. But when the stakes get high and people's careers and egos and the restaurant line, sometimes it's charged and, you know, fraught. Having said that, the disparities are great. My colleague Andy Rosenberg used to say with a wry smile, you historians live on a few grains of rice. Big money at the science trough. We brought in a couple $1 million to UNH for doing interdisciplinary work, okay? But where were the funding sources? 90% of them were from the science side. 95, but you know, we got some money from the humanities side, but most of it was from the science side. They have big money. Historians and humanists don't. That makes the arrangement less than equal, right? So I'm really glad I did this. It was very exciting for me. I got to tell you, I used to, you know, I was teaching courses in African American history and the American Revolution and some stuff like that. Like, everybody knows how the story turns out. And then we started doing this. It's like, oh, we're making this up. And so I put together a syllabus and try to draw on scientific readings, sociological readings, narratives, historical accounts, and try to get a sense of how can we ask questions about the past, the living ocean in the past, and make some sense of it. So it was actually pretty exciting, but it was, you know, not always easy. Yeah, probably easier just to teach about the American Revolution, right? Yeah.
Anybody else? Can I ask you a follow-up about the way that history informs public policy? The work that you did and the investigations of the history of the fisheries. To what extent did you see or feel or experience that being incorporated into public policy?
Yeah, thanks, Rod. I can tell you that I was ultimately very gratified. I and other members of our team were invited to NOAA's office in Silver Spring, Maryland, to make presentations. Andy Cooper, who was the biostatistician in our group, he and I went with a NOAA delegation to France one summer to work with French scientists and historians and librarians on trying to set up sort of a similar program in France. I was invited to come to Gloucester and lecture to the NOAA office in Gloucester with the regulators and scientists who actually run the surveys and the studies to decide what the kind of regulations will be on the fishery going forward. So one of my grad students actually ended up on the New England Fisheries Council for 2 terms, Matt McKenzie, boy, was my hat off to him. I was like, holy shit, Matt, this is like working in the trenches. You know, he has a PhD in environmental history, and he wrote a couple books in fisheries history, and now he's going, you know, sitting at the table with the commercial fishing interests, hammering out how the industry is going to be regulated. So in all those ways, you know, me talking to regulators and you know, having the book respected and having my own PhD students on the fisheries committee, it's pretty good. You know, I felt like we sort of made a mark. You never really know. And, you know, I retired 5 years ago, and my wife and I set off to go, you know, we thought sailing around the world till COVID came. So when Eve first invited me to do this some months ago, I got back to her and I said, I'd be happy to come and talk about the book, but if you want to have a seminar where I'm expected to be up on current fisheries policy and up on contemporary marine environmental history literature, I'm not. I've been paying attention to a 40-foot boat with a double-handed crew in the deep sea for the last 4 years, and I retired, and we left, and I'm just not current anymore. And now coming back, we're about to go back to our boat again, but coming back in the last year, I realized how quickly one's conversancy with a field that you had been immersed in really intently can be lost. In other words, if you don't stay up on your game, you know, things change. So that's why the world needs historians, because things change.
Other questions? Last chance.
Good? All right.
All right.
Thank you. I appreciate you. You've been a great audience. I appreciate you coming out.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was wonderful. Eve wanted me to let you all know that on October 26th, right here, same time, same place, the next in the series of talks will be had, and it's by Rosalind Lapierre, and it's about environmental and indigenous history. So please all come to that, October 26th, and thank you again for all coming out, and thank you once again for your wonderful talk.
Thanks, Rod.
Thank you, that was fantastic.